This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are interviewing the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, HaRav Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
The Rav posited in a recent interview that the statement in the Babylonian Talmud that 12,000 pairs of Rabbi Akiva's students were killed as a result of a plague does not reflect that which truly transpired historically. Some might be concerned that your position implies that you do not accept that which the Talmud states. How would the Rav respond?
First of all, we need to ask ourselves a few questions regarding that statement in the Talmud Bavli in Tractate Yevamot 62b. As we mentioned in an earlier interview, the figure of 12,000 pairs, 24,000 people, is a very, very large number of students for anyone to have at any time in history. Second of all, why does it say 12,000 pairs? If it's talking about 24,000 people, why did it not simply say 24,000? And the third thing is, of course, the statement in the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud as it appears before us, that they died in a plague of a certain disease referred to as askara in the Gemara, which is a kind of choking or croup kind of condition which leads to choking. It says that they died of this disease because they did not respect each other. All these points are worthy of some reflection. The fact is that it's difficult to believe, I think it should be difficult for us to believe, that the students of Rabbi Akiva, if these people were students of the great Torah sage Rabbi Akiva of the Mishnah, one of the leaders, if not the leader of his generation, and they knew him and learned from him, it should be difficult for us to believe that they did not have the basic midot, the basic understanding of how a Jew should behave, any Jew, and how much more so a Torah scholar. To believe that this is how they behave towards each other, I think this should take us, we should be taken aback by such a suggestion. The number also of 24,000 is difficult to accept as being realistic. And it's also, I think, surprising to imagine, should be rather strange in our eyes, that people would be judged by Hashem to die as a result of such behavior. The fact of the matter is that we have another version of that text of the Talmud Bavli Masechet Yevamot, and that is the text as it is quoted by Rav Sharira Gaon in his famous Igereth. Rav Sharira Gaon was the head of the great yeshiva, the Talmud Academy in the city of Pumbeditha in Bavel in Babylon in the 10th century, over 1,000 years ago, about 1,100 years ago in fact. And it goes without saying that if he has a different version, as we're about to explain now, that his version of the text of the statement in the Talmud Bavli is more correct and more authentic than the version that we have before us. Rav Sharira Gaon writes that the students of Rabbi Akiva, and he mentions the number 12,000, he does not mention the word pairs, so that already is a more reasonable number, but even so, that's a tremendous number of students for any rabbi, any sage to have. He speaks of them dying in a shmada. The Aramaic word shmada means, in Hebrew, which is shemad, this word means, and can only mean one thing, and that is an official policy of suppression and religious coercion, and including very often military means, to weaken the Jewish people's resolve and to weaken their attachment to the Torah. This is the meaning of the word shemad. It refers to a religious persecution. And this is exactly what we know from the historical sources took place at that time. We're talking about the revolt of Bar Kokhba, which began in the year 132. It lasted for 3 years to the year 135. The outcome of this revolt, which at first was successful, was the eventual desolation and destruction of the entire southern part of Eretz Israel, the area known as Yehuda, Judea. According to the Roman historian Dio Cassius, 985 major towns and villages were totally wiped off the map. 580,000 Jews were killed in the fighting during that rebellion against the Romans. He himself stresses that this figure does not include the numbers of people who died of starvation and other disease, etc. at that time. And this figure also does not include the huge number, apparently hundreds of thousands, of Jews who were taken captive and sold as slaves. The effect on the Jewish people was immense. This was one of the greatest catastrophes the Jewish people ever suffered, perhaps the greatest, perhaps even greater in some ways than the Shoah, than the Holocaust. And the Jewish people never actually recovered. Certainly the Jewish presence in the land of Israel never recovered from this blow until very recent times. According to Rav Shira Gaon, therefore, those students did not die because they did not treat each other with respect. They did not die of a disease called askara, which is a form of asphyxiation or choking. They died in war. They died as part of the Roman suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took them by surprise to the extent that the leader of the Jewish people, Shimon bar Kuzibah, who was also known as Bar Kokhba, he was the de facto ruler of the Jewish people and the land of Israel for, certainly of the area known as Yehuda, Judea, for a period of at least 2 years. If this is what Rav Shira Gaon tells us, then I strongly recommend that we take him at his word. He was much, much closer to the source, the texts, the Talmudic texts from which he learned, from which he studied in the 900s, some of which were probably very old and written 1, 2, or even 3 centuries before his own time. We're very close to the actual date of the redaction of the Talmud. And if we have a different version before us, what we need to do is ask ourselves why. And we also have to take into account that this version of Rav Shira Gaon agrees entirely with the historical facts as we know them, historical facts that Chazal themselves stress and speak about in many places, both in the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi, and in other sources from Chazal. There are many descriptions describing the events of that revolt. In the Talmud Bavli, for example, in the Tractate of Gittin, page 58, it talks about the siege of the city of Beth Tor or Beitar, which was where the revolt was finally crushed. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the Masechet Ta'niyot, Tractate Ta'niyot, it speaks about Rabbi Akiva having supported Bar Kokhba. These are the historical facts. And if Rabbi Akiva supported this revolt, and was one of the leaders, in fact, of the revolt, and he was, in fact, later imprisoned, apparently for approximately 2 years, and eventually executed by the Romans, then we have no doubt, there should be no doubt in our minds, that Rabbi Akiva was heavily involved in this revolt against the Romans, and that the Romans were very unforgiving. And it goes without saying that if he was involved, so were his students. It's also correct to say, and to understand the term used by the Chachamim and the Talmud in the quote that we mentioned before from Tractate Yevamot, when it speaks about Talmidim, I don't think we should understand it as meaning literally students in the technical sense only, but followers, all the people who accepted Rabbi Akiva's leadership. They all joined the national effort to throw off the yoke of Roman domination and persecution, which included also religious persecution. As we know, at that time, the Romans banned circumcision, Brit Milah, which was apparently one of the major causes of the revolt, and they also planned to rebuild the destroyed city of Jerusalem, which had been destroyed 6 decades earlier, but in a new form, a new shape, that is to say, a Roman city, a pagan city, and to rebuild a pagan temple on top of the ruins of the Beit Mikdash, of the temple. These things were, these two causes are mentioned by 2 different historians as being the cause for this revolt. Those are the historical facts, and Rav Shira Gaon's version is in complete concert with those facts. The version of the Talmud that we have in most printed editions in Tractate Yevamot, speaking about the students of Rabbi Akiva not respecting each other, is frankly incredible and contradicts the historical facts and the version of Rav Shira Gaon. So therefore there is no doubt in my mind which of these versions we should accept. What we need to ask ourselves is, why would anyone have presented that version of events in the text that we have before us?
In which way and for what reason did the more commonly quoted version come to be?
This, of course, is the question that may be bothering some people, but I do not believe this is actually something that is so difficult to explain. You have to ask yourself the following question. Why is it that every year when Parashat Terumah comes along, one sees in Torah sheets that are distributed in shuls and synagogues, or one can hear different rabbis on the radio, etc., speak about the parasha, which of course discusses the building of the Mishkan. The pasuk in the Torah says, "V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham." They shall build for me a mikdash, and I will reside amongst them. Many rabbis will dwell upon the word b'tocham, amongst them, rather than b'tocho, in it, the temple. And therefore the lesson they draw from it is that every Jew is commanded to create a temple, so to speak, in his heart, where Hashem will be able to dwell and reside within him. So that b'tocham, within them, refers to every individual Jew building such a place, as it were, for Hashem within him. This is a very beautiful drasha, and it conveys a very important idea, but it is not what the pasuk is speaking about. The Torah is speaking about building a Mishkan, building a Mikdash, and that as a result of that there will be Hashra'at Shekhinah, there will be the resting of the divine presence amongst the Jewish people. So why do many choose to ignore the true thrust of that parasha and of that pasuk and dwell instead upon this other idea? The reason is very simple. Because for Jews who have no conception of and no understanding and no interest really in building a Mishkan or a Mikdash, a temple, know nothing about temples and have never really thought about it, speaking about such a thing, especially at the present time in history, or if you wish to turn the clock back 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, speaking about such a thing to a Jew who has no knowledge and no understanding, no connection, cannot relate to the concept of the temple. And this is not going to therefore mean anything to him or motivate him to do anything, to improve his ways, to be a better Jew. Rather than speak about something which is removed and irrelevant, it makes sense for teachers of Torah to say something which is relevant, something which does edify and uplift the Jew and exhort him to improve his ways and be a better Jew and think about how he can, as it were, create a Mishkan, dwelling place for Hashem within himself. This is a meaningful lesson, and this can influence Jews for the better. Conveying information that means nothing to them, which they cannot even relate to, does not achieve very much at all. It's not that Judaism that the Torah is not relevant or not relevant or meaningful. It's that the reality of galut, of exile, causes, as a rule, causes the Jew to be very far removed from the true essence of the Torah, and therefore to have great difficulty relating to many aspects of the Torah. This is what I always refer to as galut mode Judaism. In that type of Judaism, it makes a lot of sense to tell people that the students of Rabbi Akiva died in such a miraculous and supernatural way. Just as regarding the Parashat Terumah, it makes sense for many people to teach their flock that the Torah is talking about building a Mishkan in one's heart, as opposed to the real Mishkan that the Torah is discussing. To give you another example, some years ago my youngest son came home from school and informed me that his teacher told him that when the Torah relates that Avraham Avinu and his servant Damesek Eliezer went off to fight the kings mentioned in Parashat Lech Lecha to free Lot, who had been taken captive, the teacher told him that, and this is quoted by Rashi, that Eliezer in Gematria is 318. It says in the Torah that Avraham took 318 armed men and chased them and attacked them by surprise and was victorious. But this is not the version that my son heard. He said that the teacher told him that Eliezer, Damesek Eliezer himself and Avraham Avinu, just the two of them, picked up pebbles and dust from the ground and hurled them at the enemy, and each particle of dust and each pebble became an arrow, and thus they killed the enemy. Is that what really happened? Well, I do not believe that's what happened. That's not what the Torah states as to what happened. In the Torah it states that Avraham had 318 fighting men. It states that he took them by surprise, that he attacked them at night, and that's an entirely credible story. The other version is a fairy tale version, which may or may not be a good thing to tell children, but it's certainly not the way a thinking, intelligent person should understand Torah Judaism. In exactly the same way, to speak about the students of Rabbi Akiva dying in a military campaign, a revolt against the Roman Empire, which many Jews, by the time the statement was made, and I do not know who made that statement, as we have it before us in the Talmud Bavli. I do know that Rav Shira Gaon did not have such a statement before him, and that to me is the more relevant and more meaningful fact that we should focus upon. But when that statement was made, as it appears before us, it was being said to an audience, a Jewish audience, that had no idea about the historical events, could not relate to that time, to that place. Jews were living in galuth, in exile. Jews were powerless. Jews were suffering pogroms, crusades, inquisitions, general persecution on a daily basis. Jews who fought the enemy with swords, with bows and arrows, with guns. This was not something that Jews could relate to. And what has that got to do with students of Torah, after all, in that version, that understanding of things? And therefore, such an event, such a version of events rather, is meaningless and does not do anything for such a Jew. But for many of us today, we are able, and we should be able, and we should try and convey these ideas to others, that Judaism is not about fairy tales, that the Bar Kokhba revolt was a reality. We know the facts, we know how it began, we know how it ended, we know what happened to those followers of Rabbi Akiva, and we have Rav Shira Gaon's word that we should take very seriously and very literally. So therefore I'm not in any way rejecting or expressing incredulity regarding the Talmudic text. I am suggesting that the true text of the Talmud read very differently as related to us by Rav Shira Gaon, and that, together with the other statements that we have by Chazal and from historical sources that tell us the true course of events at that time, that is the basis on which I made those statements, and that I think is how any thinking Jew should approach this matter.
Thank you, HaRav Bar-Hayim, and a word to our viewers. If you would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with HaRav Bar-Hayim in honor or memory of a loved one, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.